217 kilometers from shore, no boat in sight, no life jacket, just a single German shepherd swimming for his life in the merciless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The dog's muscles trembled beneath his waterlogged coat, each labored breath a battle against the inevitable, each paddle a defiance of the fate that should have claimed him hours ago. By every law of nature, every principle of survival, he should have already surrendered to the depths below. What force drives a creature to fight when all hope is lost? What invisible thread keeps the heart beating when the body has nothing left to give? And what twist of destiny places a solitary fishing boat in the exact spot where a miracle is desperately needed? If you've ever questioned the boundaries of will and spirit, if you've wondered about the mysterious bond between humans and animals, stay with us through this extraordinary journey. Subscribe to Hearts and Paws for more incredible stories that remind us of the profound connections that exist beyond words, beyond understanding, connections that can only be felt with the heart. Thomas Grady squinted against the glare of the midday sun, a weathered hand shielding his eyes as he scanned the eerily calm surface of the ocean. The stillness unsettled him. Silent waters often whispered warnings of storms to come. 6 hours into what should have been a productive fishing trip, his cooler remained empty, his spirits dampened not by rain but by disappointment. At 42, Thomas had spent more time at sea than on land. The rhythmic rise and fall of waves beneath his modest fishing vessel felt more like home than the small cabin awaiting his return on shore. The ocean had been both provider and teacher, sometimes generous, sometimes cruel, but always honest in its indifference. Something caught his eye, a dark speck against the endless blue, moving in a way that interrupted the natural flow of the current. Driftwood, he thought initially, just another fragment of someone else's story carried away by the tides. But there was something wrong about how it moved, something purposeful rather than passive. Thomas reached for his binoculars, adjusting the focus with practiced precision. The lenses revealed what his naked eye could not comprehend. A dog, head barely breaking the surface, legs still moving in desperate, weakening strokes. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, already throttling the boat forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. "That's impossible." Chapter 2, The Rescue. The distance between boat and dog closed with agonizing slowness. Each second stretched into eternity as Thomas watched the animal's struggles grow weaker, more erratic. Those paddling movements weren't instinctive anymore. They were deliberate, trained, the last desperate efforts of a mind that refused to surrender even as the body failed. As the boat drew near, the full reality of the situation struck Thomas with physical force. The dog's eyes were glazed with exhaustion, its muzzle repeatedly dipping below the surface only to emerge again with diminishing frequency. There were minutes left, perhaps seconds. "Hang in there, buddy," Thomas called out, already stripping off his shirt, dropping it in a careless heap on the deck. "I've got you." No response came from the animal, no acknowledgement, no renewed effort. It was too far gone for hope, suspended in that terrible limbo between life and death where only raw biology and stubborn will remained. Without hesitation, Thomas dove into the water, the cold shock of immersion stealing his breath momentarily before training took over. His powerful strokes carried him swiftly to the dog, whose movements had nearly ceased altogether. Salt stung his eyes, but he kept them fixed on his target, refusing to lose sight even for a moment. When he finally reached the animal, the dog collapsed into his arms like dead weight, surrender coming only when rescue was assured. Thomas cradled the massive shepherd against his chest with one arm, while using the other to propel them both back toward the boat. The animal's heartbeat fluttered weakly against his skin, present but precarious. "Stay with me," Thomas muttered through gritted teeth, fighting the current and the dog's substantial weight. Almost there, at the boat, Thomas positioned himself beneath the shepherd, pushing upward as the animal instinctively clawed for purchase on the ladder. With a final surge of strength, the dog dragged itself over the edge, collapsing onto the deck in a trembling heap of soaked fur and exhausted muscle. Thomas followed, hauling himself aboard with arms that suddenly felt like lead. He knelt beside the shepherd, chest heaving, water streaming from his body onto the deck. Beneath his palm, he could feel the shallow rise and fall of the dog's ribcage, barely there, but persistent. "You're alive," Thomas whispered, voice breaking with emotion he couldn't name. "You crazy beautiful beast, you're alive." Chapter 3, Questions Without Answers. The journey back to shore unfolded in a haze of disbelief and mounting questions. Thomas wrapped the German shepherd in a dry tarp, offering gentle words of encouragement and sips of fresh water that the animal seemed too weak to accept. 2 hours stretched before them, 2 hours of watching for each breath, each heartbeat, while the horizon remained stubbornly distant. Every few minutes, Thomas found himself glancing over at his unexpected passenger, still unable to process the sheer impossibility of what he had witnessed. The dog lay motionless, except for the subtle rise and fall of his chest, eyes occasionally flickering open to reveal amber depths clouded with exhaustion, but strangely alert. "What were you doing out there, boy?" Thomas asked softly, knowing no answer would come. 217 kilometers from shore. That's not possible, that's just not possible. The longer he considered it, the more impossible it seemed. Thomas had heard stories of dogs swimming impressive distances, but nothing like this. No animal could survive that long in open ocean, the cold, the exhaustion, the dehydration from salt water. Yet here was living proof, defying every rational explanation. More troubling still was the complete absence of identification, no collar, no harness, no tags. Just raw skin under the front legs, suggesting prolonged immersion and exertion. Thomas had encountered abandoned dogs before, cruel owners sometimes disposing of unwanted pets by tossing them overboard miles from shore. But never this far out, never beyond the sight of land. "You got a name, boy?" he asked, receiving no response. Not even a twitch of recognition. As they approached the marina, Thomas faced a decision. Protocol-dictated animal control, shelters, systems designed to reconnect lost pets with owners. But something deep in his gut resisted that path. Something about the dog's eyes, the extraordinary circumstances of their meeting, the inexplicable presence so far from shore, it all suggested a story that bureaucracy would neither understand nor respect. When land finally appeared on the horizon, Thomas Grady had already made his choice. This wasn't just another stray, this was a survivor of something profound, something mysterious. And Thomas wouldn't rest until he understood what that was. Chapter 4, A Will to Live. The small veterinary clinic just outside Clearwater wasn't accustomed to emergencies, especially not ones dripping seawater onto their freshly mopped floors. The receptionist's protest died on her lips as Thomas pushed through the door, cradling the massive shepherd in his arms. "Sir, you can't just..." "He almost drowned 135 miles out," Thomas interrupted, voice steady but urgent. "No ID, no explanation, I just need someone to look at him." The words silenced the room. A young veterinarian appeared from the back, eyes widening as she took in the scene before her. "You said 135 miles offshore?" she asked, already gesturing for Thomas to follow her into an examination room. "Found him swimming alone," Thomas confirmed, gently laying the dog on the metal table. "Middle of nowhere." The examination proceeded in tense silence, the vet's hands moving with practiced efficiency over the shepherd's body. Thomas stood back, arms crossed tightly across his chest, still damp from the sea. He watched as she checked vital signs, examined Paws, listened to the heart and lungs, drew blood, all while murmuring softly to the patient who lay unresponsive but watchful. "He's severely dehydrated," she finally announced, looking up at Thomas with professional concern tempered by something like amazement. "Scrapes, abrasions, exhaustion beyond belief." "But," she paused, shaking her head slightly, as if doubting her own assessment. "But his heart's strong. Somehow, he made it." Thomas exhaled sharply, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank God, no microchip," the vet continued, "but we did find something odd, tangled in his fur near the neck." She handed Thomas a small rusted piece of metal, a fragment that appeared to have once been part of a dog tag. Most of the engraving had been worn away by water and time, but a single letter remained visible. "R. No number, no additional text," she observed, "just the letter." Thomas turned the fragment over in his palm, feeling its weight, physical and symbolic. A single letter from a previous life, the only connection to whatever history this animal had lived before the sea claimed everything else. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, already knowing his own answer but needing to hear the official version. Officially, he should go to animal control. They'd hold him for the required period, then place him for adoption if no one claims him. She hesitated, looking between the dog and Thomas. But given the circumstances, unusual circumstances sometimes call for unusual solutions. That night, Thomas took the dog home to his modest cabin near the water. He laid out a makeshift bed of folded blankets on the floor and set out water in a shallow bowl. The shepherd still wouldn't eat, but his eyes, those intelligent, watchful eyes, followed Thomas's every movement around the small space. Before turning in for the night, Thomas sat cross-legged on the floor beside his silent guest, studying the steady rise and fall of his chest. "You made it out of something no dog should have survived," he said softly, not expecting a response. "I don't know how or why, but I promise I'm not letting you go until we figure it out." The shepherd blinked slowly, not trust, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of recognition that here, in this small cabin by the sea, he had found a temporary harbor. Chapter 5. Awakening dawn filtered through threadbare curtains, painting Thomas's small cabin in hues of gold and amber. The gentle tapping of claws against wooden floorboards pulled him from sleep, a sound so unexpected that for a moment he thought he must be dreaming. When he opened his eyes, reality proved stranger than any dream could be. The German shepherd stood in the middle of the room, moving slowly but deliberately, exploring his surroundings with methodical precision. He favored his right front leg slightly, but the improvement from the previous day's near-death exhaustion was nothing short of remarkable. "Hey, look at you," Thomas said softly, sitting up. The dog paused, turning to face him. No tail wagging, no friendly approach, just a steady gaze of assessment. Not the reaction of a typical pet, but something more measured, more calculating. Thomas moved slowly, preparing a fresh bowl of water and some plain cooked chicken he'd set aside the night before. He placed both on the floor, then stepped back, giving the animal space. The shepherd approached cautiously, sniffed the offerings, then began to eat, slowly at first, then with increasing focus. Crouching nearby, Thomas observed the dog's demeanor with growing fascination. There was nothing frantic or desperate about his eating, despite his ordeal and probable starvation. Each movement was controlled, almost dignified. "You're not just smart," Thomas murmured. "You're trained. I can feel it." The dog didn't react to the words, continuing his meal with the same methodical focus. But there was something in his bearing, in the precise way he moved, that spoke of discipline and purpose beyond ordinary domestic training. After breakfast, Thomas stepped outside onto the small dock extending from his property into the water. The morning was clear, the sea calm, ironically similar to the conditions in which he'd found the shepherd. He heard the soft patting of paws behind him, and turned to find the dog had followed, standing now at the edge of the dock, looking out across the water that had nearly become his grave. "You've seen things, haven't you?" Thomas asked quietly. The shepherd remained motionless, ears alert, gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where sky met ocean in a seamless blue line. In profile against the morning light, he looked almost regal, a creature of purpose temporarily derailed but not defeated. Thomas studied him thoughtfully, mind cycling through possibilities. His years in the Navy had brought him into contact with working dogs of various disciplines: tracking, detection, protection. This animal exhibited characteristics that suggested specialized training: the alert posture, the calm assessment, the absence of typical domestic dog behaviors. "Let's see what you know," he said finally, pulling out his phone. Chapter 6. The trained stranger Mike Russell arrived that afternoon, a tall man with graying temples and the sharp assessing gaze that came from decades working with canine units. He'd retired from official canine handling 2 years earlier, but still ran a private training center for service and protection dogs. "This better be good," he said, as he stepped out of his truck. "I was halfway through rebuilding a carburetor when you called." Thomas led him into the cabin without preamble. "I need you to meet someone." The shepherd stood in the center of the room, ears forward, watching the newcomer with focused intensity. Mike stopped just inside the doorway, his casual demeanor shifting instantly to professional assessment. He crouched slowly, bringing himself to eye level with the dog but maintaining distance. "Sit," he commanded calmly. The dog didn't move. Lie down. Again, no response. Thomas opened his mouth to explain the rescue, the ocean, the mysterious circumstances, but before he could speak, Mike extended 2 fingers, palm down, then lowered them in a slight curve. Instantly the shepherd dropped to the floor, tail tucked slightly, eyes never leaving Mike's face. Thomas stared, mouth slightly open. What was that? Silent signal, Mike replied, his expression grave. Used in tactical ops. Whoever trained him for something big. Mike stood slowly, turning to face Thomas with newfound respect and concern. You didn't just rescue a stray, my friend. You pulled a working dog out of the ocean, a specialized one. The implications hung in the air between them, heavy with unanswered questions. Thomas glanced down at the shepherd, now lying still but alert, watching them both with calculating intelligence. Why would a trained dog be 135 miles offshore? He asked, already suspecting that the answer would be more complex than either of them could guess. Mike didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. The question itself opened doors to possibilities neither man was eager to explore. Trained dogs didn't end up in the middle of the ocean by accident. They were either placed there intentionally or had escaped from somewhere they were never meant to leave. Has he shown any aggression? Mike asked finally, eyes still on the shepherd. None. He's been cautious, reserved, watchful. Mike nodded slowly. That tracks with his training. This isn't an attack dog, he's an observer. Intelligence gathering, reconnaissance maybe. Military, possibly, or something adjacent. Mike crouched again, studying the dog more closely. No visible tattoos in the ear, which is odd for a military working dog. No standard ID methods visible at all. Thomas pulled the rusted metal fragment from his pocket. Just this, caught in his fur. Mike examined it, turning the piece over in his palm. Single letter R. Could be the start of a name, could be a designation. He handed it back. Whatever it means, someone went to considerable trouble to make sure this dog couldn't be easily identified. The 2 men stood in silence for a moment, both processing the implications. The shepherd remained where he was, watching them with unnerving focus. What are you going to do? Mike asked finally. Thomas looked down at the dog, feeling the weight of responsibility settling more firmly on his shoulders. Figure out where he came from, who he belongs to, and if you don't like the answer. The question hung in the air, unanswered but understood. Some mysteries, once unraveled, couldn't be neatly repackaged and returned to their origin. Some questions, once asked, changed everything. Chapter 7, Echoes of the Past. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat by the window in the small living room, nursing a lukewarm coffee and watching the shepherd, now tentatively called Ranger based on the single letter from his tag, resting at the foot of the couch. The piece of metal sat on the coffee table between them, its mysteries multiplying rather than diminishing with each passing hour. Ranger's reactions throughout the day had only deepened Thomas's conviction that this was no ordinary dog. When a helicopter had passed overhead around sunset, the shepherd's entire demeanor had changed in an instant, body low to the ground, ears flattened, eyes hardened with what Thomas could only describe as vigilance rather than fear. It wasn't the natural response of an animal startled by loud noise. It was targeted, specific, a trained reaction to a particular stimulus. The helicopter hadn't frightened Ranger, it had triggered him. What happened to you out there? Thomas murmured, watching the steady rise and fall of the dog's chest. What were you running from? The questions demanded answers, but Thomas hesitated before the obvious next step. His retirement from the Navy had been deliberate, a conscious stepping away from systems and hierarchies and classified information. The laptop gathering dust in his closet represented a connection to networks he'd chosen to leave behind, access points to databases that civilian dog owners would never see. But Ranger wasn't a civilian pet. The silent commands, the tactical training, the specific reaction to aircraft, everything pointed to a military or paramilitary background that couldn't be explained through normal channels. Making his decision, Thomas retrieved the laptop and powered it on for the first time in years. The secured database required multiple authentication steps, legacy codes from his diving operations that he hoped were still valid. If they weren't, the attempt itself might raise flags he'd rather avoid. The screen blinked, then granted access. Thomas exhaled slowly, then typed his search parameters, minus German Shepherd, Military K-9 No Standard Identification, East Coast Operations. The results loaded slowly, files filtered by clearance level and relevance. Most were standard reports on canine units, training programs, deployment statistics, nothing that explained a highly trained dog swimming alone over 200 kilometers from shore. Then a restricted file appeared, red flagged and coded, Operation Nightmark, Animal Asset Recovery Program. Thomas had never heard of it during his service. He clicked, expecting another access denied message, but instead found himself looking at a partially redacted document with minimal information. Asset R7 Ders, breed, German Shepherd Ders, sex male Ders, assignment, offshore reconnaissance handler, classified minor status, decommissioned, presumed lost at sea. Date of deactivation, 3 days before Thomas found him. Thomas leaned back, processing the implications. They knew. Whoever had deployed Ranger, or R7, as he was apparently designated, knew he was in the ocean. They'd marked him as lost, written him off, left him to die. A soft sound behind him made Thomas turn. Ranger stood in the doorway, eyes fixed not on Thomas but on the screen, ears forward in unmistakable recognition. "You remember this, don't you?" Thomas whispered. Before Ranger could react, the crunch of tires on gravel outside broke the silence. Thomas moved to the window, carefully pulling back the curtain. A black SUV had pulled up at the edge of his driveway, its windows tinted, no visible license plates. 2 men in plain clothes stepped out, one carrying what looked like a small electronic device, the other pulling on gloves. Ranger began to growl, the sound so low it was almost inaudible. Thomas closed the laptop immediately, mind racing. Someone had been monitoring the database access. Someone knew he'd found their decommissioned asset. "Come on, Ranger," he whispered, grabbing his keys and phone. "We're leaving." Chapter 8, Flight. They slipped out the back door without a sound, Ranger moving beside Thomas like a shadow. No hesitation, no confusion, just fluid cooperation that spoke of prior training in evasion tactics. Thomas led them through the small patch of woods behind his cabin to where his old truck sat hidden by overgrowth, a precaution from years of habits he'd never fully abandoned. Once inside, Thomas started the engine with a silent prayer that the aged vehicle wouldn't betray them with mechanical failure. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, alert and focused, his body language communicating readiness rather than fear. "Whatever they were doing with you," Thomas said softly as he eased the truck onto an unmarked trail away from the main road, "they're not done, and they don't seem like the type to file missing dog reports." Ranger didn't look at him, attention fixed on scanning their surroundings through the windows. His behavior wasn't that of a pet being transported, but of a security asset maintaining perimeter awareness, another piece of the puzzle Thomas was desperately trying to assemble. They drove in silence for nearly an hour, Thomas taking back roads and unpaved trails, eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror for signs of pursuit. The SUV hadn't immediately followed them, but that didn't mean they weren't being tracked through other means. Finally, they reached a secluded marina Thomas had used during his diving days. A forgotten stretch of coastline with a few deteriorating docks and an old storage shed. It was off-grid, unmapped on most charts, frequented only by locals who valued privacy over convenience. "We'll stay here tonight," Thomas said as he killed the engine and let darkness envelop them. "Figure out our next move." Inside the shed, Thomas laid out blankets and secured the creaky door behind them. The air smelled of salt and old oil, familiar in a way that brought memories of missions long past. Ranger methodically inspected every corner before settling near the entrance, positioning himself between Thomas and the door. Guarding, always guarding. Thomas sat beside him in the dim light, filtering through cracks in the aged wood. The revelations of the day weighed heavily on him, questions multiplying faster than answers. "What were they using you for, boy?" he asked softly. "I've seen military dogs, trackers, detection units, even deep-sea deployment teams. But you're different." Ranger looked up at him, amber eyes reflecting what little light remained. The intelligence in that gaze wasn't just trained response, it was understanding. This dog hadn't just been taught to obey commands, he'd been taught to think, to assess, to decide. In a gesture that caught Thomas completely off guard, Ranger gently placed one paw on his boot. The movement was deliberate, communicative, bridging the gap between species with unmistakable intent. "You trust me now," Thomas whispered, emotion tightening his throat. Ranger exhaled softly, not quite a sigh, but something close to it, a sound of decision made and commitment offered. Thomas reached out slowly, placing his hand on the dog's neck where the fragment of tag had been found. "We're going to figure this out," he promised. "And then we're going to make sure you never have to go back to whatever put you in that ocean." Chapter 9. Confrontation. The dawn broke clear and cool, sunlight filtering through the cracks in the shed's weathered boards. Thomas and Ranger had both slept lightly, alert to every sound, every shift in the night. Now, with daylight exposing their hiding place, a new plan was needed. Thomas knelt beside Ranger, checking the healing abrasions on his legs and the raw patches under his forelimbs. The physical recovery was remarkable, another testament to the dog's extraordinary resilience. "I'm going to find out who deployed you," Thomas said, tightening the straps on a dry bag containing the essentials he'd grabbed during their hasty departure. "But they'll be looking for you now, which means you need to stay hidden." He paused, looking directly into Ranger's attentive eyes. "Unless you want out, you've been through enough. I wouldn't blame you if you disappeared into the woods and never looked back." It was an absurd offer to make to a dog, yet Thomas made it with complete sincerity, recognizing something in Ranger that transcended ordinary animal intelligence. This creature had choices, understood consequences, made decisions. In response, Ranger moved forward, positioning himself squarely between Thomas and the edge of the dock they now stood on, a clear physical statement. The message couldn't have been more explicit if spoken aloud. "We stay together. All right, partner," Thomas said softly, a mixture of relief and determination coloring his voice. "Let's find some answers." They loaded onto a small boat Thomas had stashed behind the marina years ago, fast, quiet, and barely registering on most monitoring systems. As they pulled away from shore, Thomas scanned the tree line, anxiety prickling at the base of his neck. His instincts proved correct. Half hidden among the trees sat the black SUV, its presence confirming his worst suspicions. They had tracked the truck, probably through satellite imagery or drone surveillance. These weren't local authorities or even standard military. They were operating with resources far beyond normal protocol. The passenger door of the SUV opened. A figure emerged, dressed in black, face obscured by a cap and sunglasses. He raised a phone to his mouth, speaking into it while staring directly at the departing boat. Suddenly, Ranger let out a bark, sharp, urgent, and filled with recognition rather than fear. He turned in a tight circle on the deck, body language shifting from alert to agitated. "You know him," Thomas said, watching the dog's reaction closely. "Is he your handler?" Ranger barked again, louder this time, then fixed his gaze on the receding figure with intensity that transcended animal instinct. There was history there, memory, connection. Thomas turned the boat hard toward open water, putting distance between them and the shore. "We're not ready for that," he muttered. "Not yet." Ranger eventually settled, but his attention remained fixed on the vanishing coastline. Whoever that man was, friend, enemy, or something more complex, he had triggered something profound in the shepherd's memory. One thing was now certain, Ranger remembered, and soon Thomas would know exactly what those memories contained. Chapter 10. Truth Beneath the Surface. The hidden cove Thomas navigated to was a relic from his diving years, surrounded by jagged cliffs and accessible only by water or through miles of dense, unforgiving terrain. Perfect for stopping, thinking, planning their next move. Once anchored, Thomas retrieved the printed file from his dry bag, studying again the sparse information about Asset or 7. The term offshore reconnaissance nagged at him, especially combined with the dog's remarkable swimming abilities and specialized training. "What exactly were you doing out there?" he mused aloud, Ranger sitting attentively nearby. What kind of reconnaissance requires a dog in open ocean? Even more troubling was the coldly bureaucratic language. Decommissioned and presumed lost at sea. Not missing or lost, terms that would imply value, concern, intention to recover. No, they had written him off deliberately, terminated his existence on paper because his physical termination was assumed. Yet here he sat, defying those assumptions through sheer indomitable will. They tried to kill you, Thomas said softly, the realization settling like ice in his stomach. This wasn't an accident. They meant for you to die out there. Ranger's ears twitched at his tone, but his expression remained watchful rather than fearful, a survivor assessing, not a victim remembering. Before Thomas could pursue this line of thought further, Ranger suddenly stood, ears forward, body tense with attention. Thomas followed his gaze across the water where in the far distance a helicopter appeared, black, moving swiftly, and suspiciously silent for its size. How did they find us again? Thomas muttered, immediately gathering their few belongings. Ranger let out a low whine, then jumped from the boat onto the rocky shore. He ran toward a crevice in the cliff face, where a narrow path wound upward. Without hesitation, Thomas followed, trusting the dog's instincts and training. At the top of the trail, they crouched behind a boulder, watching as the helicopter hovered briefly before descending several hundred meters away. The doors opened, and 4 figures in tactical gear emerged. Helmets, visors, no identifying insignia visible even through Thomas's compact binoculars. But the 5th figure caught his attention immediately. Unlike the others, he wore no tactical gear, no helmet, just standard clothing and a weathered face that carried authority in every line. When Ranger saw him, the dog froze completely, muscles tensed, eyes locked on the man with an intensity that told Thomas everything he needed to know. "I think I found your handler," he whispered. The man scanned the area methodically, then pulled something from his pocket, a small electronic device. When he pressed a button, Ranger suddenly flinched violently, stumbling backward with a whimper of pain. He shook his head frantically, pawing at his ears as if trying to dislodge something embedded deep inside. Hey, what's happening?" Thomas grabbed the dog's harness, trying to steady him. Ranger trembled beneath his hands, clearly in distress. Thomas looked back at the man and the device. Understanding dawned with sickening clarity. "They're trying to override you," he realized. Some kind of embedded control mechanism. The handler raised his hand, pointing directly at the cliff where they hid. No words, just a signal. Seconds later, 2 of the tactical team members started up the path toward their position. "We're leaving, now," Thomas said urgently, pulling at Ranger's harness, but the dog didn't move. He looked up at Thomas, visibly torn, something inside him still responding to the signal. Old commands, old bonds fighting against new loyalty. "I know it hurts," Thomas said, voice tight with emotion, "but you get to choose who you are now. Not them." The high-pitched pulse intensified. Ranger whimpered again, trembling violently. Then, with what seemed like monumental effort, he barked once, sharp, decisive, like a decision being announced to the universe. He turned and lunged forward, not down the escape route but directly toward the helicopter and the men approaching. "Wait, Ranger!" Thomas shouted, but even as the words left his mouth, he understood. Ranger wasn't running back to them. He was running to end it, to confront what had been done to him, to close the circle that had begun with his decommissioning in the middle of the ocean. Thomas followed, adrenaline flooding his system, every instinct from his military training surging to the surface. Ranger reached the clearing, just as the 2 tactical team members turned to intercept him. Without hesitation, the shepherd lunged at one man's leg, knocking him sideways with precision rather than savagery. The second man reached for a weapon, but Thomas tackled him from behind, years of combat training taking over. The weapon clattered to the ground as both men went down hard. One man subdued, the other disarmed. The clearing fell momentarily silent until the handler stepped forward. "Stand down, R7, he commanded. Voice even and authoritative. "Mission isn't over." Ranger froze, the voice pulling at something buried deep within his training. "Return. Mission isn't over." Thomas stepped between them, chest heaving from exertion and emotion. "It is now." The handler assessed him coolly, professionally. You think you can protect him? He's not just a dog. He's a classified tool, one with loose ends. He's not a tool, Thomas replied, voice rising. He's a survivor, and he made his choice. Ranger moved forward to stand beside Thomas, staring at his former handler. The growl that emerged from his throat wasn't one of rage or fear. It was the sound of closure, of circuits being permanently broken. The helicopter engine whined higher, rotors spinning faster. One of the tactical team shouted something unintelligible, and the group began retreating. Whether from concern about attracting attention or recognition of a battle lost was unclear. The handler lingered a moment longer, eyes locked with Thomas's. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice flat but tinged with something almost like regret. Thomas nodded. "Maybe, but it's ours to make." As the helicopter lifted off, wind blasting through the clearing and drowning all other sound, Thomas looked down at Ranger. The shepherd was trembling, but not from pain or fear, from release. Whatever bond had held him to his former handler, whatever commands had been embedded in his training, they had been broken. He was free. Chapter 11. Coming home. They returned to the boat in silence, both emotionally and physically drained by the confrontation. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the water in shades of gold and amber, Thomas wrapped a towel around Ranger's shoulders and leaned back against the deck. "You're not R7 anymore," he said softly, watching as the helicopter disappeared into the distance. "You're Ranger, and this time, no one gets to name you but you." The dog rested his head on Thomas's lap, and for the first time since his rescue, he closed his eyes completely, not from exhaustion, not from surrender to the inevitable, but from a place of genuine safety. His massive body relaxed, the vigilance that had kept him alive through impossible odds, finally giving way to trust. Thomas sat there for a long time, one hand resting on Ranger's back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. Questions still remained. Who exactly had deployed Ranger? What offshore reconnaissance truly entailed? Why they had attempted to decommission him rather than retrieve him? But those questions could wait. For now, what mattered was this moment of peace, this fragile new beginning. As night fell, Thomas started the boat's engine and set course for home. Not the cabin that had been compromised, but a new destination, a fresh start for both of them. The ocean stretched dark and infinite around them, the same waters that had nearly claimed Ranger's life, now carrying them toward whatever awaited. "You know," Thomas said quietly, "I've been rescuing things all my life, people during my service years, animals since then. But I think this might be the first time something rescued me right back." Ranger shifted slightly, pressing closer against Thomas's leg as the boat cut through the gentle waves, carrying them toward a future neither could have imagined just days before. Chapter 12. A new beginning. A week passed since the confrontation on the cliff. The ocean was calm again, the sky clear, soft with spring sunlight, and on the edge of a quiet coastal town in Florida, far from Thomas's compromised cabin, a modest rental house had become something neither Thomas nor Ranger had experienced in a long time, a home. Ranger lay sprawled on the porch, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed in contentment. A warm breeze carried the scent of salt and jasmine, ruffling his fur gently. His body had begun to fill out again, stronger, more relaxed. The wounds on his legs were healing, but more significantly, the tightness in his gaze was gone. The war behind his eyes had quieted. Thomas stepped out of the house, carrying a bowl of grilled chicken and rice. "You better be hungry. That's the good stuff." Ranger's ears perked up immediately. He stood, stretching long and slow, a luxury of movement that spoke of security and comfort, before trotting over to Thomas. No hesitation, no fear, no calculation. He ate calmly, tail sweeping lazily behind him, occasionally glancing up at Thomas as if to share his appreciation. When he finished, he sat beside Thomas, both of them watching the waves roll gently onto the shore just beyond their property line. Thomas took a deep breath, savoring the peaceful moment. They hadn't heard anything from the men in black since that day at the cliff. Perhaps they'd moved on, perhaps they were still watching from a distance, but the silence no longer felt threatening, it felt like acceptance. "Looks like they gave up," he said, more to himself than to Ranger. "Guess they figured you were already home." Ranger blinked slowly, his body leaning against Thomas's leg in silent affirmation. Later that afternoon, they ventured into town for the first time together. The small pet supply store on Main Street had prepared something special, having heard fragments of their story through the local grapevine. The owner, Linda, greeted them with a warm smile as they entered. "You must be Ranger," she said, crouching to eye level with the shepherd. "You've become quite the legend around here." Ranger sniffed her extended hand politely, offering one respectful tail wag in response. There was a dignity to his interaction with strangers now, cautious but no longer hyper-vigilant, reserved but not fearful. Linda held up a hand-crafted leather collar, smooth and supple, with a single word embossed in gold across the front, "Ranger." "I thought he might like something official," she explained to Thomas. "Something with his real name." Thomas took it with quiet reverence and knelt beside Ranger, carefully fastening the collar around his neck. "There," he said, softly, "your real name, no code, no asset number, just you." Their next stop was the beach, not the open sea, where Ranger had nearly drowned, but a quiet sandy stretch with shallow waves and the distant sound of children's laughter carrying on the breeze. Ranger stepped cautiously onto the sand, ears alert but not tense. The ocean sounds no longer triggered that military stillness in him. They were simply part of the background music of his new life. Thomas tossed a tennis ball gently down the shore. Ranger hesitated, looking first at the ball, then at Thomas, as if confirming that this was indeed play rather than training. "Go on," Thomas encouraged. "It's just for fun." The shepherd took off after the ball, not with the mechanical precision of his former training, but with a newfound freedom of movement. When he returned, tongue lolling slightly, Thomas couldn't help but laugh. "You're officially a beach dog now," he declared, rubbing Ranger's ears affectionately. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, they returned to their new home. Ranger curled up at the foot of the porch, while Thomas sat beside him, arm resting casually across the dog's back. They stayed that way for a long time, saying nothing because sometimes the most powerful things don't need words to be understood. Chapter 13. Echoes. 3 months passed, summer giving way to early autumn. Thomas found work at a local marina, his expertise with boats proving valuable to tourists and locals alike. Ranger accompanied him daily, quickly becoming a fixture among the regular visitors who brought treats and took selfies with the miracle dog, though few knew the true extent of the miracle he represented. On quiet afternoons when business was slow, Thomas would often find himself watching Ranger interact with children on the dock, patient, gentle, protective, in a way that seemed to transcend his military training. It was during these moments that Thomas felt most certain they had made the right choice that day on the cliff. Yet questions lingered, fragments of Ranger's past occasionally surfacing in unexpected ways. The shepherd still reacted to certain triggers. The distinctive sound of military helicopters would cause him to freeze momentarily, and particular electronic tones would make his ears twitch and his body tense. These weren't panic responses, they were muscle memory, neural pathways carved through intensive training that couldn't be completely erased. One evening, as they walked along a deserted stretch of beach, Thomas spotted something in the distance, a man in uniform standing near the water's edge, watching them approach. Military bearing, regulation haircut, the unmistakable posture of command. Thomas tensed, hand automatically moving to Ranger's harness. But the shepherd showed no signs of distress, no recognition. As they drew closer, the man nodded respectfully. "Beautiful dog," he commented, eyes assessing Ranger with professional appreciation. "German shepherd?" "Yes," Thomas replied cautiously. "Thanks, I work with them overseas," the officer continued. "Military working dogs, best partners a soldier could ask for." He glanced at Thomas, something knowing in his gaze, loyal to the end. Sometimes beyond what their handlers deserve. Before Thomas could respond, the man handed him a folded piece of paper, then turned and walked away, disappearing around a bend in the shoreline. With trembling fingers, Thomas unfolded the note. "They've closed the program. Asset Ore 7, officially KIA. You're both clear. Some battles aren't worth fighting, especially against men who can swim 135 miles to freedom." A friend asterisk Thomas stared at the paper, then at Ranger, who was watching the waves with peaceful attention, unaware of the closure this moment represented. Someone on the inside had chosen to let them go, to officially end the search, to grant them both the peace they had fought so hard to claim. That night, Thomas burned the note in a small fire on the beach, watching the flames consume the last official connection to Ranger's past. The shepherd lay beside him, head on paws, eyes reflecting the dancing light. "It's over," Thomas said softly. "You're just Ranger now, forever." Chapter 14, full circle 1 year to the day after Thomas had pulled a dying German shepherd from the middle of the ocean, they returned to the marina where that extraordinary journey had begun. Thomas's fishing boat, freshly painted and meticulously maintained, waited at the dock. "What do you think?" he asked, watching Ranger's reaction carefully. "Ready for a different kind of voyage." The shepherd studied the boat, then looked up at Thomas with clear, calm eyes that held no trace of fear or hesitation. He stepped confidently onto the deck, taking position at the bow, as if he'd been doing it all his life. Thomas smiled, chest tight with emotion he couldn't fully name. "I'll take that as a yes." They set out just before dawn, the sky still purple with the last traces of night. Other fishing boats were heading out as well, friendly waves exchanged between captains who had come to know the man and his remarkable dog over the past year. None of them knew the full story. Thomas had kept those details private, but all recognized the special bond between the two. As they reached deeper water, Thomas cut the engine, letting the boat drift gently on the calm surface. The rising sun painted everything in gold, transforming the ordinary into something sacred. He joined Ranger at the bow, both of them looking out at the horizon, where sky met ocean in seamless continuity. 1 year ago today, Thomas said quietly, hand resting on Ranger's back, "I found something impossible out here. A dog swimming alone, fighting to live when everything said he should give up." Ranger leaned against his leg, solid and warm and present. "I didn't know then that I was drowning too," Thomas continued, "just in a different way, alone in that cabin, cut off from purpose, from connection." He knelt down, bringing himself eye to eye with the shepherd. "You saved me too, you know, gave me something to fight for again." Ranger held his gaze, amber eyes filled with an understanding that transcended language. Then, with deliberate gentleness, he pressed his forehead against Thomas's chest, a gesture of such trust and intimacy that it momentarily robbed Thomas of breath. As they returned to shore later that morning, the marina was unusually busy. A small crowd had gathered near Thomas's usual docking spot, colorful balloons tied to the posts. "What's going on?" Thomas muttered, maneuvering carefully toward the dock. As they drew closer, a banner came into view, strung between 2 posts, "Happy Rescue Versary, Ranger." Below it stood Linda from the pet store, Mike the K9 trainer, and a dozen other locals who had become friends over the past year, all waiting with smiles and packages. "Hope you don't mind," Linda called as Thomas secured the boat. "We thought it deserved celebrating." Ranger took in the scene with calm curiosity, showing none of the wariness that would have characterized him a year before. When a small girl approached with a handmade card, he lowered his head gently to accept her tentative pat. "Is it true he swam in the ocean for days?" she asked Thomas, eyes wide with wonder. Thomas glanced at Ranger, then back at the child. "He did something even braver," he said softly. "He refused to give up when giving up would have been easier." The impromptu celebration continued through lunch, a community gathering around a story most only knew pieces of, drawn together by the universal truth it represented, that sometimes survival itself is the most profound act of courage. As the afternoon waned and guests began to depart, Thomas found himself alone with Ranger on the dock, watching boats return from their day at sea. Mike approached, hands in pockets, expression thoughtful. "You never did find out exactly what he was trained for, did you?" he asked quietly. Thomas shook his head. "Some mysteries are better left unsolved." Mike nodded slowly. "Whatever it was, I've never seen a dog transform like he has." "From operative to just a dog," Thomas finished. "The best kind of dog, not just a dog," Mike corrected gently. "A reminder that we all get to choose who we become, regardless of who tried to define us before." As twilight descended, Thomas and Ranger walked home along the beach, the shepherd occasionally racing ahead to investigate interesting scents before returning faithfully to Thomas's side. Their footprints traced parallel paths in the damp sand, separate but aligned, distinct but connected. Thomas stopped to watch the last rays of sun disappear beyond the horizon, the very ocean that had nearly become Ranger's grave now transformed into a canvas of beauty before them. "Not all rescues start with a plan," he said quietly. "Not all heroes wear badges, and not all broken things stay broken." Ranger pressed against his leg, solid and warm and alive. Sometimes Thomas continued, "All it takes is being found." Epilogue: the cabin by the sea stands empty now, its windows dark, its dock weathered by storms and seasons. Inside, dust gathers on abandoned furniture, silence fills rooms once briefly occupied. To passing boats, it appears forgotten, another coastal property left to decay. But twice a year, a man and a German shepherd visit under cover of darkness. They never stay long, just enough time to check the perimeter, ensure nothing has been disturbed, leave no trace of their presence, except perhaps a single paw print in the soft earth by the porch steps. Some battles end with surrender, others with victory, but the rarest conflicts conclude with understanding, with recognition that what was fought for has evolved beyond the original cause. In a coastal town 50 miles away, that same man and dog live quiet lives. The man teaches diving lessons at the local marina. The dog accompanies him everywhere, distinguished not just by his regal bearing, but by the custom collar he wears, a single word embossed in gold against the leather. Ranger. Children flock to him, drawn by some instinctive recognition of his gentle strength. Adults notice something in his amber eyes, a depth, a wisdom, a story they can sense but cannot read. Few know that this dog once swam alone in the vastness of the ocean, fighting currents and exhaustion and his own programming. Fewer still understand that his greatest act of courage was not surviving those impossible odds, but choosing, each day after, to trust again. And no one, except the man who found him, knows that sometimes, late at night when the house is still and quiet, Ranger still stands at the window, ears alert, watching the horizon, where sky meets sea in eternal vigilance. Not from fear, not from training, but from the understanding that some journeys never truly end. They simply transform us into creatures capable of greater compassion, deeper connection, and more profound love than we ever imagined possible. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Hearts and Paws for more tales that remind us all, no matter how lost we feel, there's always a way back home. Remember to like this video and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Ranger's journey reminds us that sometimes, our greatest strength lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall, and in recognizing the hands that reach out to help us up. In the vastness of life's ocean, we are all in some way, swimming towards something we cannot yet see, a shore, a purpose, a connection that will make sense of our struggles. Ranger's story isn't just about a dog who survived impossible odds. It's about the extraordinary capacity within all living beings to transcend their circumstances, to rewrite their programming, to choose connection over isolation, trust over fear, love over conditioning. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that sometimes the most profound rescues are mutual, that in reaching out to save another, we often find ourselves saved in return.